The autumn morning arrived with the kind of golden sunlight that made everything seem possible, the sort of day that should have been spent playing in parks or laughing with friends. Instead, 9-year-old Emma Richardson stood at the base of the courthouse steps, her small hand gripping her mother's with desperate intensity. Her other hand clutched a worn, stuffed rabbit, a relic from happier childhood days when life had made sense. The courthouse loomed before them, an imposing structure of gray stone and imposing columns that seemed designed to intimidate. Emma had never been inside a real courthouse before. The closest she'd come was watching courtroom dramas on television with her grandmother, dramatic shows where justice always triumphed and good defeated evil. Real life, she was discovering, didn't follow television scripts. Her mother, Sarah Richardson, squeezed Emma's hand reassuringly, though her own palm felt clammy and cold despite the warm morning. Sarah had changed her outfit 4 times that morning, a nervous habit Emma had noticed over the past 2 years of her parents' separation. First, it was the navy suit that made her look too corporate. Then the casual dress that seemed too informal for court. Finally, she'd settled on dark slacks and a cream-colored blouse that struck some imaginary middle ground between competent and sympathetic. Sarah's lawyer, a woman named, had coached her extensively on appearance. Every detail mattered in custody cases, she'd explained. Emma understood she was the reason for all this stress. She was 9 years old, and somehow her entire existence had become illegal. "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, bending down to Emma's level. Her mother's eyes were red-rimmed from crying the night before. Emma had heard her through the bedroom wall, sobbing quietly into her pillow at 2 a.m. "Just tell the truth about how you feel. The judge will listen and everything will work out." Emma nodded, though doubt gnawed at her stomach like a hungry animal. Nothing had worked out for the past 2 years. Why would today be different? The truth was more complicated than her mother realized. Emma did love her father. She loved her mother too. But something toxic had grown between her parents over the past 24 months, something that had metastasized into this legal war, with Emma caught squarely in the middle. It had started with arguments about money, then escalated to accusations about parenting styles, infidelity, and suitability. Each parent now viewed the other not as a former partner but as an enemy to be defeated. And Emma's love for both of them had become, somehow, a weapon in their war. Her father, Robert Richardson, was already waiting in the courthouse lobby when they arrived. He stood talking with his lawyer, Mr. Harrison, a tall man with silver hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than Emma's mother made in a week. Robert was a successful financial analyst, a career that had consumed him during the marriage, and now funded this custody battle with ruthless efficiency. He'd 6 months ago to a woman named Victoria, someone Emma barely knew. Victoria was often cold to her, making comments about how Emma was too emotional and undisciplined. Robert seemed like a different person around Victoria, less like the father Emma remembered from childhood. When Robert spotted Emma, his face transformed momentarily into something genuine and warm. He started toward her, but Mr. Harrison placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering something. The warmth evaporated instantly, replaced by a calculated expression. Even at 9 years old, Emma understood. She was no longer his daughter in this moment. She was evidence in a case. A custody battle had a way of transforming love into strategy. Approached Sarah with a thick folder of documents. "Remember the strategy we discussed," she said quietly, positioning herself so Emma couldn't hear every word. "Don't let him make you emotional. Stay focused on his failings as a parent, his infidelity, his lack of presence in Emma's life." Emma caught fragments of the conversation, enough to understand that her childhood, her most private moments, her vulnerabilities, were being weaponized. Stories she'd shared with her therapist about nightmares and anxiety were being prepared as testimony. Every minor mistake her father had made was being cataloged, and every shortcoming of her mother's was being similarly weaponized by Mr. Harrison. The past 2 years flashed through Emma's mind like a nightmare. The day her parents first told her they were separating, her father's careful, rehearsed explanation about how they still loved her but couldn't live together anymore. The hollow words that sounded reasonable until reality set in. The day she'd had to pack half her possessions into suitcases for her first weekend at her father's apartment. The endless questions from well-meaning relatives about which parent she liked better, questions that felt like betrayal no matter how she answered. The grades that had slipped as anxiety consumed her focus. The birthday party that both parents had wanted to attend, creating a logistics nightmare that had ruined what should have been a happy day. And then there was the custody battle itself. What had started as a friendly arrangement evolved into something vicious when Robert decided he wanted primary custody, motivated, Emma suspected, more by Victoria's influence and his pride than any genuine desire to parent her full-time. The legal fees mounted. The accusations flew. Emma's mother had been forced to take a second job to pay her lawyer. Emma's father had hired the most aggressive attorney money could buy, someone who viewed custody cases not as matters of human connection, but as battles to be won at any cost. Emma's therapist, doctor, had tried to help her navigate the emotional minefield. But even therapy had become complicated when both parents wanted access to her session notes, both convinced that Emma was favoring the other parent. Doctor had eventually recommended Emma for an animal-assisted therapy program, something to help her manage the anxiety and stress that had become her constant companion. That's where Bailey had entered her life. Bailey was a golden retriever, 3 years old, from a specialized training program for therapeutic animals. When Emma first met him at the program intake, something had shifted in her chest. This dog didn't care about custody arrangements or legal strategies or which parent was winning. Bailey loved her completely and unconditionally, asking nothing but her presence and affection. Over the weeks of training, Emma had learned specific techniques, hand signals and verbal cues that helped her manage anxiety when it threatened to overwhelm her. Bailey had learned to recognize her distress and provide comfort. They developed a language together, a secret communication system that helped Emma survive the unsurvivable. Getting Bailey approved to attend today's hearing had been its own battle. Robert's attorney had opposed it, arguing it was emotional manipulation designed to prejudice the court. Emma's therapist and her mother's lawyer had fought back with research about therapeutic animals and their role in trauma recovery. The court had finally approved Bailey's presence, a small victory that meant everything to Emma. Now, standing in the courthouse with her mother, Emma could hear Bailey in the hallway beyond. The familiar woof, the click of his nails on the marble floor as he was led to the courtroom by his handler. That sound grounded her somehow. No matter what happened inside that courtroom, no matter what words were twisted or what truths were buried under legal strategy, Bailey would be there. Bailey would know her, love her, see her as she truly was. Not a legal asset to be fought over, but a frightened 9-year-old girl caught in circumstances beyond her understanding. "It's time," said gently, placing a hand on Emma's shoulder. "The judge is ready for us." Emma took a deep breath, squared her small shoulders, and moved toward the courtroom doors. She had no idea that inside that room, one tiny hand signal would change everything, that her desperate attempt to find comfort in chaos would reveal the profound damage that adult warfare inflicts on innocent children. She only knew that her heart was breaking, that her world had become incomprehensible, and that soon, a judge would ask her questions she wasn't equipped to answer about a situation no child should ever have to face. The courthouse doors loomed before her, and Emma stepped forward into her uncertain future. The courtroom was simultaneously smaller and more imposing than Emma had imagined. The wood paneling seemed to absorb sound, creating an oppressive silence that made her of every breath, every heartbeat, every nervous movement. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, clinical glow that stripped away any sense of warmth or safety. The judge's bench loomed at the front like a throne, elevated and austere. Rows of empty seats stretched behind her, the gallery where her parents sat, where Bailey waited, where her entire future would be decided by adults who didn't know her, didn't love her, didn't understand the peculiar horror of having your childhood become a legal proceeding. A court officer guided Emma to the witness stand, a wooden box that seemed designed specifically for making children feel small and vulnerable. She had to stand on a booster seat just to be at eye level with the attorney. Her hand trembled as she placed it on the Bible. The words of the oath washed over her in a confusing blur. Swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The truth. As if there were a single truth about love, about family, about her parents' failures and her own pain. Her mother's lawyer conducted the initial questioning, what her father called the friendly examination, but what Emma understood was strategic positioning. Asked gentle questions designed to establish Emma's emotional attachment to her mother, to paint a picture of a loving parent sacrificing everything for her child. Emma answered in quiet, careful words, acutely aware that everything she said could be used against either parent. "Emma, can you tell the court what a typical day looks like when you're with your mother?" asked warmly, her tone granular and sympathetic. Emma described her mother's routine, waking her with breakfast, helping with homework, tucking her into bed with a story. She mentioned how her mother had taken a second job to pay for her therapy, how she'd attended every school event, how she stayed up late listening to Emma's anxieties. Emma's voice grew steadier as she talked about the good things. For a moment, she forgot about the oppressive courtroom, the cameras outside, the war being waged around her. Then finished her examination and returned to her seat. Mr. Harrison stood slowly, deliberately, like a predator rising from a couch. He was at least 6 feet tall, and from Emma's vantage point in the witness stand, he seemed impossibly large, impossibly powerful. He didn't approach her with the gentleness had used. Instead, he positioned himself strategically, not facing Emma directly but angled in a way that forced her to shift uncomfortably to maintain eye contact. Emma had read about intimidation tactics in a book about psychology her mother had left on the coffee table. She recognized what he was doing, even if she couldn't articulate it. "Emma," Mr. Harrison began, his voice carrying a sharp edge beneath a veneer of civility, "you mentioned that your mother works 2 jobs now. Isn't that correct?" "Yes," Emma answered quietly. "So your mother is away from home frequently, working long hours." She comes home as soon as she can," Emma replied, her confidence already fraying. "But she's not always there, is she? Not like a parent with a stable, consistent schedule who works regular business hours and can provide reliable." He didn't wait for her answer. "Your father, on the other hand, has built a successful financial career. He's stable. He's secure. Those are important things for a child's development, wouldn't you say?" Emma felt the trap closing around her like a cage. She tried to explain that financial stability wasn't the same as emotional stability, but the words tangled on her tongue. She was 9 years old. She wasn't equipped for this. Mr. Harrison continued, his questions becoming progressively more cutting. "Has your mother ever left you with a babysitter while she worked? Has there ever been a time when she prioritized her job over spending time with you?" Every answer Emma gave was twisted. When she mentioned that her mother had hired a babysitter occasionally, Mr. Harrison presented this as negligence. When she acknowledged missing her mother during her second job shifts, he framed this as evidence of parental abandonment. The attorney was expert at this, not lying exactly, but recontextualizing truth until it became damaging ammunition. "Let's talk about your father's new family," Mr. Harrison said, shifting his attack. "You like Victoria, don't you?" Emma hesitated. This was dangerous territory. Victoria was cold, dismissive, sometimes cruel in her subtle ways. But Emma also understood that criticizing her father's new wife could hurt her father. She was trapped between honesty and loyalty, between speaking her truth and protecting someone she loved. She's nice," Emma lied, the words hollow in her mouth. "You spend time with her regularly when you visit your father." "Sometimes," And your father has expressed to you that he wants you to live with him and Victoria, that he believes that arrangement would be better for you. He said he thinks it would be good, Emma admitted, her voice barely audible. Mr. Harrison smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. So your father has plans for your future. He's thinking ahead. He's planning to create a stable household with his new family. Wouldn't you agree that shows commitment to your... Emma wanted to scream. She wanted to explain that her father's plans didn't include what she actually needed, that Victoria had made it clear Emma would be an inconvenience in their new life, that her father had been distant and distracted during recent visits, more focused on his new marriage than on her. But the words stuck in her throat, imprisoned by the complexity of the situation and her own 9-year-old inadequacy in the face of legal maneuvering. The interrogation continued, relentless and punishing. Mr. Harrison asked about Emma's grades, implying her mother's stress was affecting her schoolwork. He asked about Emma's therapist, suggesting that her mother had created her anxiety by making her feel like a burden. He asked about her father's new house, with its extra bedroom and its proximity to a better school district, laying groundwork for an argument about superior living conditions. Each question was designed not to elicit truth, but to construct a narrative. The narrative was becoming increasingly clear. Emma's mother was struggling financially, emotionally unavailable, and inadvertently harming her child through her own inadequacies. Emma's father was stable, successful, and planning for his daughter's future. Never mind that this narrative bore little resemblance to Emma's actual lived experience. Tears began streaming down Emma's face about halfway through the cross-examination. She tried to hold them back, pressing her lips together until they hurt, but the emotion was too overwhelming. She was 9 years old, and she was being dissected by an expensive attorney whose job was to destroy her mother's credibility by using her own words, her own loyalty, as weapons against her. The court officer offered Emma a glass of water. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped it. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, her mother's expression anguished in the gallery, her father looking uncomfortable, the judge's face unreadable. Bailey. She needed Bailey. She needed someone who loved her without agenda, without strategy, without weaponizing her words for litigation purposes. "One more question, Emma," Mr. Harrison said, and her stomach plummeted. "One more attack, one more wound. When your father asked you recently which parent you'd prefer to live with, what did you tell him?" This was the kill shot. This was the moment that would be replayed in arguments for weeks, the moment that would be cited as evidence that Emma herself preferred her father's household. Emma felt the pressure of the moment crushing down on her. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. Instead, her hand moved without conscious intention. She touched her ear twice, then pointed downward with her index finger. A signal, a plea, a desperate cry for help from someone who actually understood her. In the gallery, Bailey's entire body went rigid. His ears perked up. He let out a soft whine, a sound of pure, uncomplicated compassion directed at the little girl drowning in the witness stand. Judge, watching this interaction, suddenly sat forward in her chair. Something had shifted in the courtroom. Something that no lawyer, no strategy, no clever line of questioning could control. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Harrison stood mid-stride, his momentum halted by something he couldn't quite identify. Emma sat in the witness stand, her small frame rigid with tension, tears streaming down her face as she waited for his response to her unanswered question. The tension was suffocating, pressing down on everyone present like a physical weight. The court stenographer's fingers hovered above her machine, waiting for words that hadn't yet come. Emma's eyes darted toward the gallery where Bailey sat, and in that moment, something remarkable happened, something that would later be described as the pivotal moment in her case, though nobody fully understood its significance in real time. Her right hand lifted slightly from the edge of the witness stand, trembling with the weight of her desperation. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. Those seated in the back rows of the gallery probably didn't even notice. The court officers, absorbed in their routine responsibilities, remained focused on administrative tasks rather than the testimony unfolding before them. But Emma knew exactly what she was doing. Over the past 8 weeks of animal-assisted therapy with Dr. and Bailey's handler, no relation to the judge, Emma had learned a series of graduated signals designed to communicate her emotional state when words became impossible. The signals were therapeutic tools, specifically designed for children experiencing trauma and anxiety. They allowed communication without the vulnerability of verbal articulation, a lifeline for kids whose emotions had become too overwhelming, too complicated, too dangerous to express directly. Emma's right hand lifted to her ear. She touched it deliberately twice in a deliberate, measured rhythm. Touch, touch. The gesture was specific. In the lexicon of signals she and Bailey had developed together, this particular movement meant, "I'm overwhelmed, I'm anxious, I need grounding." Had taught her this signal during her 3rd therapy session, after Emma had suffered a full panic attack in the middle of a session when they'd been discussing her father's remarriage. The room remained silent, still waiting, still tense. Then came the second part of the signal. Emma's index finger extended downward in a clear, intentional point. Not aggressive or accusatory, but rather a gesture of surrender, of asking for help, of signaling distress. In the therapeutic animal language Emma had learned, this downward point meant, "I need you, I need help, I need comfort." It was a call for assistance, a flag waving in the darkness of her overwhelming emotion. The signal lasted only 2 seconds, 3 at most. It was so brief, so subtle that most people in the courtroom would later struggle to recall whether they'd actually seen it or merely sensed something unusual about Emma's demeanor. The gesture wasn't dramatic. It wasn't performed. It was genuine, raw, and utterly devoid of theatrical intent. This was a child in genuine distress reaching out to the one entity in the courtroom that had been trained to recognize that distress. Bailey's response was immediate and profound, the physical manifestation of months of careful training, bonding, and therapeutic work. The golden retriever, who had been sitting calmly beside his handler in the gallery with the trained composure expected of service animals, suddenly became electric with attention. His ears, which had been resting naturally against his head, perked upward in sharp points. His entire body language shifted from relaxed to actively engaged. His eyes, which had been softly focused on the courtroom in general, locked directly onto Emma with laser-focused intensity. And then Bailey vocalized, not a bark, which would have been disruptive and alarming, but a soft whine. It was a sound specifically trained into him, a vocal acknowledgement that said without words, "I see you, I hear you, I'm here for you." The whine carried a quality that seemed to penetrate the marble walls of the courtroom, reaching into the heart of anyone who understood its significance. For those who didn't know Bailey, the sound was simply a dog's soft cry. For Emma, it was a lifeline. For those who understood animal-assisted therapy, it was recognition of genuine therapeutic communication. Mr. Harrison's train of thought derailed completely. He'd been prepared for difficult testimony, for emotional breakdowns, for legal arguments and strategic counters. But he hadn't been prepared for this, for a silent language occurring right before his eyes that he couldn't interrupt, couldn't control, couldn't weaponize for his argument. He glanced toward his client, Robert, as if seeking guidance. Robert looked confused, his expression shifting between concern for his daughter and uncertainty about what had just transpired. In the gallery behind Emma's mother, Sarah Gripp's arm. "What just happened?" she whispered urgently. Eyes were narrowed, her legal mind already working to understand this unexpected development. She'd attended Emma's therapist appointment with the court psychologist present, had learned about the signals, understood their significance. Her expression shifted from concern to cautiously hopeful as she realized what Emma had just communicated and how brilliantly it had done so. The judge's eyes, however, were the most telling. Judge sat motionless, her hands folded on her bench, her gaze fixed on the interaction between Emma and Bailey with complete, undivided attention. Her face had transformed. The neutral, impartial expression she'd maintained throughout the morning's testimony had dissolved into something more complex. There was recognition there, understanding, and beneath it all, a profound shift in how she was viewing the case unfolding before her. Harrison regrouped, attempting to continue with his questioning as if nothing remarkable had occurred. "Emma, I'm still waiting for your answer. What did you tell your father when he asked which parent you preferred to live with?" His voice had lost some of its edge, though, replaced by uncertainty. The smooth performance of aggressive cross-examination had been disrupted by something entirely outside his control. Emma's eyes remained fixed on Bailey. The dog had settled back into a calm sit, but his attention remained entirely on the child in the witness stand. The therapeutic work was complete. Emma had signaled, Bailey had responded, and the exchange of comfort and grounding had been silently communicated to everyone present, whether they fully understood it or not. Emma began, her voice stronger than it had been moments before. The anxiety hadn't disappeared. Her trauma hadn't evaporated, but something had shifted in her internal landscape. She'd made contact with her emotional anchor. She'd asked for help, and that help had arrived. It was enough. Not to answer the question. She was still unsure how to answer it without betraying one parent or another, but enough to keep functioning, to keep breathing, to not completely shatter under the weight of impossible expectations. Around the courtroom, people were processing what they'd witnessed, though most couldn't articulate what they'd seen. A few jurors exchanged confused glances. One elderly woman in the gallery leaned toward her companion and whispered something. A court officer shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something significant had occurred but uncertain what it meant. The court stenographer, years into her job, had recorded the verbal testimony but wondered if she should somehow note the non-verbal communication that had just taken place. But Judge's mind was moving in entirely different directions. She'd recognized the signal immediately, the deliberate hand movements, the trained precision, the therapeutic intent behind the gesture. She'd seen similar signals demonstrated when her own daughter had been training service animals years ago. She understood that what she just witnessed wasn't a cute dog-and-girl moment, but rather evidence of something deeply troubling. This child had been forced into a position so psychologically damaging that she needed to be trained in specialized trauma responses to survive her own custody hearing. The implications expanded like ripples across a still pond. This wasn't just about which parent Emma should live with. This was about what the legal system was doing to her in the process of trying to protect her. This was about collateral damage, psychological warfare, and the devastating impact of adult conflicts on innocent children. Emma finally answered Harrison's question, but her voice was quieter, more composed, less susceptible to manipulation. I told him I love both my parents and I don't want to choose." It was an imperfect answer, inadequate to the legal proceedings, but perfect in its truth. And somewhere in the galleries and benches of that courtroom, Judge was already beginning to formulate a response that would overturn everything about how this case had been proceeding. The signal had been sent, the message had been received, and nothing in this courtroom would ever be quite the same again. Judge had been sitting on the bench for 24 years. In that time, she had presided over hundreds of custody cases, divorce proceedings, contested adoptions, and child welfare hearings. She'd seen the worst of human nature, parents weaponizing their children, lawyers manipulating evidence, families torn apart by anger and ego. She'd also seen the best of human nature, parents sacrificing everything for their children's, conflicts resolved through mediation and mutual respect, families finding healing after heartbreak. Her years on the bench had taught her to recognize patterns, to sense when something fundamental was shifting in a courtroom, to understand the unspoken communication that often mattered more than the testimony being recorded for legal proceedings. But nothing in her experience had quite prepared her for what she just witnessed. Judge's hands, which had been resting on her bench in her typical composed position, stilled completely. Her pen, which she'd been using to make notes throughout the morning's testimony, stopped mid-stroke. Her eyes, sharp and observant after decades of judicial practice, locked onto Emma with an intensity that seemed to penetrate far beyond what a 9-year-old girl in a witness stand could ordinarily command. In that moment, Judge wasn't just observing a child testifying in a custody case. She was recognizing something far more significant: evidence of trauma, psychological damage, and the collateral destruction that the legal system itself was inflicting on an innocent child. The signal had been unmistakable to anyone with knowledge of therapeutic animal protocols. Judge possessed that knowledge because of her daughter, who had spent 3 years training service dogs for various disabilities and therapeutic purposes, had brought her work home, literally and figuratively. Judge had attended demonstrations, listened to detailed explanations of how therapeutic animals communicated with their human partners, and witnessed firsthand how these trained signals could be the difference between a child managing crisis and a child experiencing complete psychological collapse. The hand gestures Emma had made were too deliberate to be accidental, too precise to be coincidental. They were trained movements, practiced repeatedly until they became muscle memory, the kind of training that took weeks, if not months, of consistent work, which meant Emma had been receiving professional help for her anxiety, which meant her mother had recognized something deeply troubling about her child's psychological state and had taken action to address it, which meant this child was in genuine trauma. Judge's mind, trained by decades of legal practice to synthesize complex information rapidly, began assembling pieces of a much larger puzzle. The girl's trembling hands, the tears that had been flowing since Harrison's cross-examination began, the way Emma kept seeking visual contact with the dog in the gallery, the fact that she'd been trained in therapeutic animal signaling in the first place. These weren't the signs of a well-adjusted child navigating a routine custody case. These were the manifestations of a child in psychological crisis. And the most damning realization of all, the legal system, her courtroom, her case, the very proceedings designed to protect Emma, was the primary source of her trauma. Judge had seen Mr. Harrison's aggressive cross-examination tactics before. They were effective, legally sound, and within the bounds of acceptable courtroom procedure. But watching them deployed against a 9-year-old girl who'd been forced to develop trauma responses just to survive testifying about her own life, that put them in an entirely different light. Harrison hadn't been merely questioning a child witness. He'd been deliberately targeting her vulnerabilities, exploiting her loyalty to both parents, constructing a narrative designed to undermine her mother's credibility using Emma's own words and emotions as weapons. And Emma had been so trained, so primed to comply, so desperate to please the authority figures around her, that she'd answered every question, submitted to every line of attack, and continued fragmenting emotionally in front of a courtroom full of strangers. Judge's eyes shifted briefly to Robert Richardson, Emma's father, who was watching the proceedings with the detached demeanor of someone who'd handed the situation over to his expensive attorney and was now merely observing the results. Robert seemed genuinely unconcerned about his daughter's emotional state, focused instead on the strategic progress of his case. He'd hired Harrison precisely because the man was effective at winning custody battles, consequences to the child's apparently being secondary considerations. Then she looked at Sarah Richardson, Emma's mother, whose face was a study in anguished helplessness. Sarah understood what was happening to her daughter. She'd brought Emma to therapy, enrolled her in the animal-assisted program, tried every avenue available to help her child survive the custody battle. And despite her best efforts, she was forced to watch courtroom protocol preventing her from interfering, as her daughter was systematically deconstructed by legal machinery that didn't care about the human cost. Sarah's attorney had her head turned slightly toward Emma, and Judge could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, how to use this emotional display, how to frame it in narrative form, how to convert Emma's trauma into evidence supporting her client's position. It was cynical, yes, but it was also the reality of custody litigation. Everyone in that courtroom, from the attorneys to the parents to the court officers, had become complicit in a system that weaponized a child's pain. But Judge wasn't a passive observer bound by the constraints of legal procedure and precedent in a way that prevented her from seeing the fundamental injustice unfolding before her. She was the judge. Her authority extended beyond merely applying law. She had responsibility for the of those who appeared in her courtroom, particularly minors who had no choice in their participation. The moment Emma had made that signal, the moment Bailey had responded, something had crystallized in judicial consciousness. This case was no longer about determining which parent was more suitable. This case had become about preventing a child from suffering further psychological damage in the name of legal proceedings. The legal system's approach to custody disputes, adversarial, winner-take-all, constructed around two opposing narratives with no consideration for the child's actual needs, had proven fundamentally incompatible with genuine child welfare. Judge's mind raced through the implications. Emma had been in therapy for how long? Months. And what had driven her to therapy in the first place? Not the separation itself. Children often adjusted to that with appropriate support. No, what had driven Emma into therapeutic crisis was the custody battle, the constant conflict, the being forced to choose between parents, the of her own words and emotions, the legal system's insistence that her testimony mattered in determining who got to be her parent. And now that same system, through attorneys and procedures designed to fairly represent both sides, was systematically destroying the child in real time. Judge's expression shifted into something her law clerks and frequent courtroom observers would recognize. The look she got when she'd recognized an injustice she was determined to correct. It was a look that had preceded several groundbreaking rulings, decisions that had been cited in legal journals and precedent-setting opinions. It was the look of a judge who decided that the letter of the law was insufficient when applied to a particular human circumstance. She glanced at the court clock. It was 11:47. She glanced at the court stenographer, who was still dutifully recording testimony. She glanced at Harrison, who was preparing another line of questioning, another attack vector, another attempt to extract damaging testimony from an emotionally devastated child. Judge set down her pen with deliberate finality. The small click it made seemed to reverberate through the courtroom, drawing everyone's attention. Her expression had transformed from neutral judicial observation into something far more purposeful. She opened her mouth to speak, and everyone in the courtroom sensed that something fundamental was about to change. "Recess," she announced, her voice carrying the absolute authority of her position. "Immediate recess. Bailiff, clear the courtroom except for essential personnel. I want the child psychologist present in my chambers in 5 minutes. This proceeding is suspended pending my evaluation of the minor's fitness to continue testimony." The courtroom erupted. Attorneys stood simultaneously. Robert looked shocked. Sarah's face flooded with confused hope. Bailey, sensing the shift in emotional energy, sat up, his therapeutic attention still focused on Emma. Judge was already standing, her expression set with grim determination. She'd made a decision that would overturn everything about how this case had been proceeding. She'd recognized that the legal system, in its well-intentioned quest to fairly represent both parents, had become the primary instrument of Emma's trauma. And she was going to stop it. As Emma was led out of the witness stand, she made eye contact with the judge one final time. In that moment, Judge conveyed a single message through her expression. "I see you. I see what's happening to you, and I'm going to do something about it." For the first time in months, Emma felt like maybe, just maybe, an adult in this system actually understood what was happening to her. The judge's chambers were a stark contrast to the imposing formality of the courtroom. Soft afternoon light filtered through large windows that overlooked the courthouse plaza below. The space was lined with law books, legal documents and personal photographs, images of Judge's family, her daughter with various service dogs, pictures from graduation ceremonies and family vacations. It was a room designed to be calming, professional, yet surprisingly human. Emma had never been in a judge's chambers before. She wasn't even entirely certain what a recess meant, though she understood it involved leaving the courtroom and meant the questioning had stopped, at least temporarily. A court officer had escorted her through quiet hallways away from the gallery, away from the oppressive weight of all those watching eyes. Bailey had been left behind, though his handler had given Emma a reassuring nod before she was separated from her therapeutic companion. Emma felt his absence acutely, like losing an anchor in turbulent water. Without Bailey, the anxiety threatened to claw its way back up her throat, threatening to overwhelm her again. Judge sat behind her desk, the elevated authority of the bench replaced by a more accessible height. She gestured to a comfortable chair across from her, not the rigid wooden chairs of the courtroom, but an office chair with cushioning and armrests. Beside the judge sat Doctor, the court psychologist, a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and the practiced patience of someone accustomed to working with traumatized children. Doctor had a notebook open, though she seemed less focused on recording information and more focused on observing Emma's demeanor. "Emma," Judge began, her voice stripped of the formal judicial tone she used in the courtroom, "I want you to know that you're not in trouble. Nothing you say in this room will be used against you or your parents. This is just a conversation between three adults who care about you. Does that make sense?" Emma nodded slowly, uncertainty still etched into her small frame. She'd been told multiple times that the courtroom was a place where telling the truth was important, where her words mattered. But the truth in the courtroom had been twisted, manipulated, weaponized. Why should this space be different? "I noticed something in the courtroom," Judge continued, choosing her words carefully. "I saw you make a hand signal to Bailey. That was a very specific movement. Can you tell me what that signal means?" Emma's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected anyone to understand the signal, let alone the judge herself. For a moment, she hesitated, protective instincts warring with the desire to finally be understood by an adult who seemed to genuinely want to know her truth rather than use it against her. It means I need help," Emma said quietly. "That I'm too anxious and I can't handle things. Doctor, my therapist, not you, she taught me that with Bailey. When I can't say words, I can make the signal and Bailey knows I need him. It calms me down." Doctor made a note, her expression compassionate. Judge leaned forward slightly, her judicial demeanor completely set aside in favor of genuine human concern. "How long have you been working with Doctor and Bailey?" the judge asked. Since June," Emma replied, counting back in her head. "That's about 2 months ago. Doctor said I have anxiety from stress and that Bailey could help me manage it in ways that talking sometimes can't." "And what was the stress you were experiencing in June?" Judge pressed gently. Emma's voice became smaller, more vulnerable. "My dad said he wanted me to live with him in Victoria instead of my mom. He said he could provide better for me. My mom started crying a lot. Lawyers started calling and sending letters. Everything got scary and confusing. I couldn't sleep. I had nightmares about my parents yelling at each other. One day at school I just broke down. I couldn't breathe right. The school nurse called my mom, and that's when my mom took me to Doctor." Doctor exchanged a meaningful glance with Judge. 2 months of therapeutic intervention. That suggested a child in genuine crisis, not simply reacting to parental separation, but actively experiencing trauma responses. "Emma, I need to ask you something very important," Judge said, her voice steady but filled with genuine concern. "In the courtroom, Mr. Harrison was asking you questions about your parents. Some of those questions seemed to upset you very much. Can you tell me what was going through your mind during that time?" Emma's lower lip began trembling. She pulled her hands into her lap, her small fingers interlacing nervously. The question opened a floodgate of emotion she'd been holding back throughout the morning's testimony. "Was trying to make me say bad things about my mom," Emma said, her voice breaking. "He kept asking questions like she didn't care about me, like she was leaving me alone, like my dad was better. But that's not true. My mom works hard so she can take care of me. She's always there when it matters. But no matter what I said, he made it sound bad, like her having a job was bad, like me missing her sometimes meant she was a bad parent. And then he asked me which parent I love more and—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Her entire body began shaking as the emotion she'd been suppressing erupted. Tears flooded her face, not the controlled tears of courtroom testimony, but genuine, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very core of her being. She was 9 years old, and she'd been forced to testify in a proceeding where everything she said could be used to hurt one of her parents, regardless of her actual meaning or intent. Doctor moved her chair closer and offered Emma tissues, but didn't attempt to interrupt the release of emotion. Sometimes children needed to break down completely before healing could begin. Judge watched, her face a mixture of compassion and righteous anger at a system that had allowed this child to reach such a state of psychological crisis. "I don't want to choose," Emma sobbed. "I love both my parents. I need both my parents. Even when they're fighting, I love them. And I know my dad loves me, but I don't understand why he's trying to take me away from my mom. And I don't understand why my mom has to work so much. And I don't understand why the lawyer kept making everything I said sound like it was bad. It's not fair. It's not fair." The fundamental injustice of the situation, articulated by a 9-year-old who'd been subjected to legal machinery far beyond her comprehension or control, hung in the air of the judge's chambers. Judge stood and came around her desk, positioning herself at Emma's eye level. "Emma, I want you to listen to me very carefully. What you experienced in that courtroom, the way Mr. Harrison questioned you, the way he tried to manipulate your words, that was not okay. And I want you to know that what happened was not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. You were put in an impossible situation and you handled it as best as you could. Do you understand?" Emma nodded through her tears, though her expression suggested she didn't fully believe it. She'd been taught her entire life to respect authority, to answer questions honestly, to cooperate with adults. And then when she did exactly that, her cooperation had been twisted against her and the people she loved. "I'm also going to tell you something that I don't usually tell children in my cases," Judge continued, "but I think you need to hear it. I made a mistake. I allowed the legal process in this case to continue in a way that was harming you, even though I should have recognized that harm sooner. When I saw your signal to Bailey, I realized what was happening. And I want you to know that I'm going to make changes so that you don't have to go through anything like this again. You're is going to become the center of this case, not which parent wins, not which lawyer is more clever, but you, your actual needs, your actual feelings, your actual safety." Emma looked up at the judge, her tear-stained face expressing a fragile hope. "Really?" "Really," Judge confirmed. "I promise you that." Doctor leaned forward. "Emma, doctor, your therapist told me about the work you've been doing with Bailey. That work is very important. I want to continue that work, and I want your parents to understand why it's so important. The signal you made in the courtroom, that was you asking for help. That was you communicating that you needed support. That's not weakness. That's strength. That's you advocating for your own. And that's exactly the skill you need to develop to navigate what your family is going through." For the next hour, Emma sat in the judge's chambers and told her story, not the fractured narrative extracted through hostile questioning, but her actual truth. She described her parents' relationship before the separation, her confusion and pain after it began, her desperate desire for both parents to somehow find a way to co-parent without destroying her in the process. She described her fears about the future, her anxiety about the courtroom, her gratitude for Bailey and her therapist. And as Emma spoke, judge and doctor listened, truly listened, not to build a legal case, but to understand a traumatized child's actual needs. By the time Emma finished, both adults were clear about one critical fact. This case had to be fundamentally restructured. Emma couldn't survive continued adversarial litigation. She needed intervention, healing, and parents who understood that their conflict was the primary source of her trauma. Judge looked at Doctor and made a decision that would reshape everything that followed. "Send word to counsel," Judge instructed. "We're reconvening in 30 minutes, and Doctor, I'll need your expert recommendation in writing by tomorrow morning. I'm about to issue an order that will fundamentally change how we approach this case." The courtroom had returned to its default state of controlled tension while waiting for proceedings to resume after the recess. Attorneys huddled with their clients, whispering strategies and contingency plans. Court officers moved through the space with practiced efficiency, ensuring documents were organized and the judge's bench was prepared. The gallery had filled with additional observers. Word had spread that something significant was occurring in Judge's case, and journalists, legal scholars, and curious citizens had begun to gather. Bailey remained in his position, his handler maintaining the dog's calm demeanor, though the animal seemed to sense the shift in emotional energy throughout the space. Robert Richardson sat with Mr. Harrison, the two men conferring in low voices about how to proceed with the cross-examination. Robert appeared satisfied with how the morning's testimony had gone. He believed they'd successfully undermined Emma's mother's credibility and positioned him as the more stable, reliable parent. Harrison was already strategizing about which aspects of Emma's testimony to emphasize in his closing argument, how to construct a narrative that would persuade the judge to award primary custody to his client. Neither man seemed particularly concerned about Emma's emotional state during the interrogation. From their perspective, that was simply part of the judicial process, uncomfortable but necessary. Sarah Richardson sat with her attorney, and the two women were engaged in intense discussion about damage control. Sarah's face was etched with worry and guilt. She'd watched her daughter be systematically destroyed by hostile questioning and felt helpless to intervene. Was attempting to frame this as an opportunity, suggesting they could use Emma's emotional distress as evidence of the harm the custody battle itself was causing. But even she seemed to recognize that something had shifted, some intangible quality in the courtroom's atmosphere that suggested Judge had arrived at conclusions that went beyond standard custody litigation. When Judge entered, everyone stood immediately, a reflex trained into anyone who'd spent time in courtrooms. But this time, something was distinctly different about her demeanor. Her expression was grave, her jaw set with determination, her eyes carrying an intensity that suggested she'd moved beyond neutral judicial observation into something more purposeful. She took her seat at the bench and gazed out across the courtroom with an expression that seemed to encompass everyone present in a single assessment. "Before we proceed," Judge announced, her voice carrying through the courtroom with absolute authority, "I need to address what has transpired in these proceedings this morning and explain certain observations I've made that will substantially alter the trajectory of this case." Mr. Harrison began to rise as if to interject, but the judge's sharp glance silenced him immediately. Judge wasn't asking for permission to speak. She was informing everyone present that she had reached conclusions and was about to share them. "I have presided over this bench for 34 years, Judge began, her voice measured but carrying evident emotion beneath the professional tone. "I have encountered countless custody disputes, each one presenting variations on the same fundamental human tragedy, the breakdown of a family relationship, and the collateral damage inflicted on the children caught within that breakdown. What I witnessed in this courtroom this morning, however, represents something I have come to recognize as systemically destructive to the very child these proceedings are ostensibly designed to protect." She paused, allowing her words to settle into the consciousness of those present. The courtroom had become completely silent. Even the ambient sounds of the building seemed muted in the face of the judge's pronouncement. During cross-examination of the minor, I observed Emma Richardson make a specific hand gesture directed toward her service animal. That gesture was not random. It was not emotional theatrics. It was a trained therapeutic signal, a communication developed through specialized animal-assisted therapy, indicating psychological distress and requesting grounding support. The fact that this 9-year-old child has been trained in trauma response techniques typically reserved for individuals suffering from PTSD or severe anxiety disorders speaks volumes about what this litigation process has inflicted upon her. Judge's gaze moved across the courtroom, landing briefly on each key participant. The legal system in this case has adopted an approach in which the minor's testimony is extracted through adversarial questioning, designed to construct competing narratives about parental fitness. The attorney representing the father conducted what I can only describe as an aggressive interrogation of a child experiencing genuine psychological distress. That interrogation was legally permissible. It was procedurally appropriate. It was also fundamentally harmful to the individual whose best interests this case purports to serve. Mr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly preparing to mount a professional defense of his cross-examination tactics. Judge's expression silenced any impulse he might have had to speak. "This is not a criticism of Mr. Harrison's legal competence," the judge continued. Mr. Harrison was doing precisely what he was hired to do, aggressively challenging testimony to undermine the opposing parent's credibility. The problem is not with Mr. Harrison. The problem is with a system that requires such tactics to be deployed against children who have already been devastated by family dissolution. She turned her attention to both parents. During my private consultation with the minor, Emma articulated something that I believe is the fundamental truth this case has obscured through legal maneuvering. She stated, and I quote, "I don't want to choose. I love both my parents. I need both my parents. Even when they're fighting, I love them. This child does not want to be involved in custody determination. This child does not want to testify about which parent is more suitable. This child wants her parents to find a way to co-parent despite their personal conflicts. And instead of facilitating that outcome, this adversarial litigation has forced her to participate in proceedings designed to generate evidence that one parent is superior to the other." Judge leaned forward, her expression intense and unyielding. "I have also been informed by the court psychologist that the minor has been receiving specialized therapeutic treatment to manage anxiety stemming directly from this custody battle. The separation itself did not cause this psychological distress. The litigation did. The constant conflict, the being forced to choose between parents, the of her own words, these are what have traumatized Emma Richardson." The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Everyone present understood that Judge was about to make a decision that would overturn the standard approach to this case. "Effective immediately," Judge announced, "I am restructuring these proceedings. I'm no longer going to permit adversarial litigation designed to determine which parent is more worthy of primary custody. Instead, I am going to pursue a restorative model focused entirely on the minors and her need to maintain healthy relationships with both parents while shielded from parental conflict." She looked directly at Robert Richardson. "Mr. Richardson, I am aware that you sought this custody hearing because you believed you could provide Emma with superior living conditions and parental engagement. I am equally aware that my decision today will disappoint you. However, I want to be unambiguously clear. Your daughter's psychological is not negotiable, and I will not allow her to be further traumatized by litigation designed to advantage one parent at the expense of the other." Then she turned her attention to Sarah Richardson. "Ms. Richardson, while I recognize that you have attempted to support your daughter through this crisis, I also want to be clear that you are not exempt from responsibility for the harm this litigation has caused. Both parents bear responsibility for allowing this conflict to escalate to a point where their child requires trauma counseling." Had begun taking rapid notes, her legal mind already processing the implications of the judge's statements. Mr. Harrison appeared stunned, his carefully constructed strategy apparently dismantled by judicial pronouncement before he'd had opportunity to present his closing argument. I am issuing a comprehensive order addressing the minor's therapeutic needs, modified custody arrangements, mandatory parental cooperation requirements, and specific prohibitions on continued adversarial litigation. Judge continued. These orders will be detailed in a written decision, but the fundamental principle is this. Emma Richardson will no longer be forced to participate in legal proceedings designed to determine which parent is more suitable. Her parents will be mandated to participate in family therapy and co-parenting counseling. Any violation of these orders will result in immediate custody reevaluation and potential criminal charges for contempt of court. She looked toward where Bailey sat in the gallery. I'm also officially recognizing the therapeutic service animal as an essential component of the minor's mental health support. This animal will have full access to both residential locations and educational facilities. Any attempt to prevent or restrict this access will constitute a violation of court orders. Finally, Judge Gaze moved to Emma, who was watching from a side door where she'd been waiting during the recess. The judge's expression softened slightly, though her professional demeanor remained intact. Emma, I want you to know that this courtroom is no longer going to be a place where you are forced to participate in your parents' legal battles. Your job is not to determine custody arrangements. Your job is to be a 9-year-old girl with the opportunity to heal from what this process has inflicted upon you. The adults in your life, myself included, have a responsibility to create an environment where that healing can occur. She addressed the entire courtroom one final time. I will not accept further adversarial proceedings in this case. If the parties cannot cooperate, I will make custody determinations unilaterally. However, my preference is that we move forward with a therapeutic model designed around the minor's actual needs rather than the parents' competing legal positions. Court is adjourned for 30 minutes. I want all counsel in my chambers immediately. As Judge rose to exit the bench, the courtroom erupted into hushed conversations and stunned reactions. Mr. Harrison was already conferring with his client, apparently formulating responses to the judge's pronouncements, but everyone present understood that something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer a traditional custody case. This was a judicial intervention designed to protect a child from being destroyed by the very system meant to protect her. Bailey, sensing the shift in emotional resolution, released a soft whine, not distress, but something approaching satisfaction. His job had been to help Emma survive, and somehow, in a way nobody had anticipated, Emma's desperate signal to her therapeutic companion had catalyzed systemic change. The judge's chambers had become ground zero for a different kind of custody proceeding, one focused on healing rather than winning, on restoration rather than litigation, on the child rather than the parents' competing interests. Emma's silent scream, expressed through a trained hand signal to her dog, had been heard by someone with the authority and moral clarity to respond. Judge's chambers had been transformed into a makeshift conference room, with attorneys, parents, and various court officers gathered around a large mahogany table. The judge sat at the head, doctor positioned beside her with extensive documentation, and a court recorder capturing every word for the official record. The atmosphere was entirely different from the typical adversarial energy of settlement conferences. This was not negotiation between competing interests, but rather judicial mandate being constructed around a child's therapeutic needs. I want to be absolutely clear about what I am ordering, Judge began, her voice steady and brooking no argument. These orders are not suggestions. They are not flexible guidelines subject to parental interpretation or legal challenge. They are mandatory court orders enforceable through contempt proceedings and potential criminal sanctions. Anyone who violates these orders will face immediate consequences. She gestured to Doctor, who began distributing comprehensive written orders to all parties present. The document was extensive, pages detailing specific requirements, prohibited behaviors, and therapeutic mandates designed to transform how Emma's parents would interact with each other and with their daughter. First, Judge continued, joint custody remains in effect but with substantial modifications. Mr. Richardson and Ms. Richardson will maintain equal parental time with Emma, but this schedule will be coordinated through a professional parenting coordinator, someone neutral, trained in therapeutic family dynamics, whose role is to facilitate cooperation and prevent conflict escalation. Neither parent will communicate directly about custody matters without the coordinator present. Sarah Richardson's expression shifted slightly, not quite relief, but recognition that full custody wasn't being awarded to her father, which had been her fear throughout the morning's testimony. Robert Richardson's face darkened with disappointment. He'd clearly expected his financial superiority and Harrison's aggressive cross-examination to translate into primary custody. Second, the judge continued, both parents will participate in mandatory weekly family therapy for a minimum of 1 year. This is not optional. This is not contingent on parental preference. You will attend sessions, and you will engage in good faith in therapeutic work designed to help you manage your conflict in ways that do not harm your daughter. Doctor has provided me with recommendations for qualified therapists experienced in trauma-informed family dynamics. Sessions will occur in my presence initially, with quarterly evaluations determining whether private sessions become feasible. Mr. Harrison leaned toward his client and whispered something. Robert's jaw clenched. Judge's sharp glance silenced any impulse to object. Third, the judge proceeded, Emma will continue her individual therapy with Doctor and her animal-assisted therapy with Bailey. These sessions will continue for a minimum of 18 months, with Doctor providing monthly progress reports to this court. Any attempt by either parent to discontinue these therapeutic services, to restrict Emma's access to Bailey, or to interfere with therapy sessions will constitute contempt of court and result in immediate custody modification. Was taking careful notes, her legal mind already assessing appeal possibilities and potential challenges. But Judge's next statement seemed to foreclose that avenue. Fourth, the judge announced, I am implementing a comprehensive gag order on this case. No public statements, no media interviews, no discussion of case details with anyone outside of the therapeutic team and legal counsel. This includes social media, family conversations, or any communication that could reach the public domain. The purpose of this order is to protect the minor from additional trauma and to prevent either parent from using public opinion to pressure the other. Violations of this gag order will result in substantial fines and potential jail time. This was extraordinary. Gag orders in custody cases were rare, and Judge's willingness to impose one signaled her complete rejection of custody litigation as public spectacle. This was not about winning in court or proving one's position correct to the court of public opinion. This was about creating protected space for a family to heal. Fifth, Judge continued, I'm establishing a specific behavioral code that both parents must follow. This code includes no negative statements about the other parent in Emma's presence, no interrogation of Emma about the other parent's activities or personal life, no attempts to alienate Emma from her other parent, and no use of Emma as a messenger or go-between. Any violation of this behavioral code will result in immediate court intervention. She turned a piercing gaze toward both parents. I want you to understand what you have done to your daughter through your conflict. You have created a situation where a 9-year-old girl required professional trauma training just to testify about her own life. You have forced her to participate in adult legal proceedings she cannot possibly navigate with appropriate emotional support. You have transformed her into a pawn in your personal war with each other. And you have done all of this while claiming to act in her best interests. The courtroom fell silent. Both parents seemed to shrink under the weight of judicial condemnation, delivered not through formal legal language, but through direct, unvarnished truth. What I am ordering today, Judge continued, is not punishment. It is intervention. It is my attempt as a member of this judicial system to reverse the damage that system has inflicted on your daughter. I am taking the extraordinary step of restructuring these proceedings around your child's actual needs rather than your competing legal positions. This is not how custody cases typically proceed. This is not standard judicial practice. I am doing this because standard practice has proven devastatingly harmful to Emma Richardson. She looked directly at Mr. Harrison. I want to acknowledge that your cross-examination this morning was technically competent. You were doing precisely what you were hired to do. But the system that requires such tactics to be deployed against children is fundamentally unjust. I am choosing to break that system in this case, and I am warning the legal community that future cases appearing before me will follow the model I am establishing here, not the traditional adversarial model. Then Judge addressed the court recorder. Let the record show that I am issuing this order based on findings that 1. The litigation process itself has caused significant psychological harm to the minor. 2. Adversarial custody proceedings are incompatible with child welfare when that child is directly subjected to hostile interrogation. 3. The minor's therapeutic needs require a paradigm shift away from traditional custody determination. And 4. The court has responsibility to intervene when judicial procedures are causing harm to vulnerable individuals, particularly children. She turned back to the parents. You will receive a comprehensive written order detailing all of these requirements. You will have it reviewed by your attorneys, but understand that I will not entertain legal challenges to the fundamental structure of this order. You are welcome to challenge specific details through proper legal channels, but the therapeutic framework is non-negotiable. Doctor interjected with her professional recommendations. I recommend that both parents engage in individual therapy as well, not just family therapy. The conflict that has emerged in this case suggests underlying issues, possibly around anger management, conflict resolution, or unresolved feelings about the divorce itself, that individual therapy could address. This would benefit not only the parents but would significantly enhance the family therapy outcomes. Judge nodded in agreement. I am therefore ordering individual therapy for both parents as well, in addition to the family therapy. This will help you develop the emotional regulation and communication skills necessary to successfully co-parent. Doctor will provide recommendations for individual therapists, and you will provide this court with monthly progress reports. She addressed the financial implications. Court-ordered therapy is an expense. I am aware that this case has already consumed significant financial resources for both parties. However, your daughter's mental health is more important than saving legal fees. The costs associated with this therapeutic intervention will be split equally between both parents. If financial hardship prevents compliance, notify this court, and we will explore options. But financial burden is not an acceptable excuse for avoiding mandatory therapy. Finally, Judge addressed the most unconventional aspect of her order. I am officially recognizing Bailey, the therapeutic service animal, as an essential component of Emma's mental health support. This animal will have complete access to both residential locations, all educational facilities, and all therapeutic settings. Bailey's presence in Emma's life is not optional or subject to parental preference. Any attempt to restrict, prevent, or interfere with Emma's relationship with Bailey will constitute a violation of this court order. She looked at Robert Richardson specifically. I am aware that Ms. Victoria Richardson has expressed concerns about the dog in your household. I am aware that there may be logistical challenges with maintaining a dog across 2 residences. I do not care. Emma's need for Bailey's therapeutic support supersedes any inconvenience to either parent. If maintaining this arrangement proves impossible, then we will revisit the custody schedule. But the answer is not to remove Bailey from Emma's life. The answer is for you to adapt your living arrangements to support your daughter's mental health. Judge gathered the documents before her. I am scheduling a follow-up hearing in 6 weeks. At that time, I will review compliance reports from the therapeutic team. I will assess Emma's emotional state, and I will determine whether the therapeutic model is functioning effectively. If parents are not complying with orders, if therapy is not progressing, if Emma continues to experience trauma, I have the authority to modify custody arrangements, restrict parental access, or pursue other interventions up to and including involvement of Child Protective Services. She stood, signaling the meeting's conclusion. This case has fundamentally changed. You came here expecting a traditional custody determination where one parent would be declared the winner. Instead, you are now required to participate in a therapeutic process designed to heal your family. Your daughter's is no longer negotiable. Your preferences are secondary. Emma's needs are primary. I trust you will adapt your behavior accordingly. As the attorneys and parents began gathering their documents, Judge called out one final statement. I want to note for the record that this decision is based on observations of a therapeutic animal's response to a child in distress. That response provided evidence of trauma more compelling than any testimony or legal argument. It is a reminder that sometimes the most important truths in a courtroom are communicated not through words, but through the unconditional compassion of those who love us. Emma's signal to Bailey revealed what her words could not, and I am grateful that I had the wisdom to recognize and respond to that signal. As everyone filed out of the chambers, one fact was undeniable. Custody law in Judge's district had been fundamentally transformed, and it had taken a 9-year-old girl, a golden retriever, and one judicial officer with the moral clarity to recognize systemic injustice and the courage to overturn it. 18 months had transformed Emma Richardson in ways that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the traumatized girl who'd in Judge's courtroom. She sat on a bench in the courthouse hallway, the same courthouse that had been the site of her deepest fear and psychological pain, but everything felt different now. The marble halls that had seemed oppressive and threatening were now simply architecture, neutral background to her life rather than symbol of her devastation. Bailey rested his golden head on her lap, his breathing calm and rhythmic, grounding her with his steady presence as she waited for her quarterly wellness check-in with Judge. The appointments had become routine now, predictable, supportive, focused entirely on Emma's continued emotional development and family stability. The judge no longer needed to intervene with crisis management. Instead, these quarterly meetings had evolved into something resembling mentorship, a space where Judge could observe Emma's genuine healing and offer guidance as the family adapted to their new reality. The 18 months following Judge's groundbreaking order had unfolded in phases, each one marked by genuine transformation rather than the surface-level compliance that both parents had initially demonstrated. The first phase, months 1 through 3, had been chaotic. Both parents had struggled with the behavioral requirements and mandatory therapy. Robert had initially attempted to challenge several aspects of the order through legal motions, only to have Judge reaffirm every requirement and add additional consequences for his noncompliance. By month 2, he'd stopped fighting and had genuinely committed to the therapeutic process. Sarah had struggled differently, not with resistance but with guilt. She'd internalized responsibility for the custody battle, believing that if she'd simply surrendered primary custody to Robert, Emma wouldn't have had to testify. Her individual therapist had spent considerable time helping her understand that shared responsibility didn't mean she'd failed. Both parents had participated in escalating conflict. Both had allowed legal strategy to override their child's. Both needed to change. The family therapy sessions had been excruciating for everyone initially. Doctor, the therapist, not the judge, had facilitated conversations that neither Robert nor Sarah had wanted to have. Conversations about their respective failures. Conversations about the anger they'd harbored toward each other. Conversations about their fear that they were irredeemably damaged as parents. Emma had participated in some sessions, carefully structured so that she wasn't forced to arbitrate between her parents or take sides. Other sessions had been parents-only, creating space for Robert and Sarah to address their own issues without burdening their daughter with adult emotional baggage. By month 6, something fundamental had shifted. Emma had attended school for an entire week without an anxiety attack. Her grades had improved from C's and D's to B's and A's. Her nightmares, which had plagued her for the first year following her parents' separation, had largely ceased. Doctor had noted in her clinical observations that Emma was no longer manifesting trauma responses. No hypervigilance, no avoidance behaviors, no dissociative episodes. The therapeutic work was producing measurable, genuine healing. More importantly, Emma's parents had begun to communicate with increasing civility. The parenting coordinator, a woman named Jessica Martinez who specialized in high-conflict divorce cases, had facilitated a shift in how Robert and Sarah interacted. Initially, all communication had been scripted and formal, mediated by Ms. Martinez. But gradually, as both parents developed genuine emotional regulation and stopped viewing each interaction as a battle to be won, they'd begun to communicate directly about logistical matters. By month 9, they were able to attend Emma's school events together without tension. By month 12, they'd even shared a birthday celebration for Emma that felt like an actual family occasion rather than a custody arrangement. The breakthrough had come around month 14. Robert had attended his individual therapy session and had what his therapist described as a profound reckoning with his own behavior. He'd realized that his push for primary custody hadn't actually been about Emma's best interests. It had been about his wounded pride, about proving to Sarah that he was the superior parent, about winning a competition rather than facilitating genuine co-parenting. When he'd shared this realization with his therapist, the emotional breakthrough had led to significant changes in his relationship with both Sarah and Emma. Robert had approached Sarah one afternoon during an exchange at the parenting coordinator's office and had offered a genuine apology. Not a legal apology designed to mitigate his liability, but a human apology acknowledging harm he'd caused. He'd wept as he'd articulated how his actions had traumatized his daughter and how he'd allowed his new marriage to Victoria to interfere with his relationship with Emma. Victoria, witnessing his genuine emotional work in therapy, had begun to soften her stance toward Emma. By month 16, Victoria had actually enrolled in a parenting class specifically designed to help step-parents facilitate healthy relationships with their stepchildren. It wasn't perfect, and Victoria would never be Emma's mother, but she transformed from an obstacle to a potential ally in Emma's. Sarah, meanwhile, had worked through her own issues in individual therapy. She'd addressed her abandonment trauma, her tendency to overfunction in relationships, and her unconscious teaching of Emma that emotional needs were burdensome. By month 12, Sarah had become comfortable setting boundaries with her daughter, something Emma actually needed in order to develop healthy autonomy. The second job had gradually become unnecessary as financial pressures eased with the resolution of the custody battle and its associated legal fees. By month 15, Sarah had transitioned to a single, stable position that provided both financial security and emotional availability. Bailey had become something of a legend in the therapeutic community. Doctors' decision to document Emma's therapeutic progress in a peer-reviewed journal article had brought significant attention to animal-assisted therapy in custody cases. 3 other children in Maple County had been granted therapeutic service animals in custody proceedings following judge precedent-setting decision. 4 judges across the state had begun attending seminars led by Judge on trauma-informed custody proceedings. A nonprofit organization had been founded specifically to train therapeutic animals for children experiencing custody litigation trauma. Bailey, through no intention or effort of his own, had become instrumental in systemic change. Emma's own development had been remarkable. Her anxiety, which had been nearly debilitating 18 months earlier, had been substantially reduced through the combination of therapy, Bailey's support, and most importantly, her parents' genuine commitment to reducing conflict in her presence. She developed genuine friendships at school, something that had been impossible when her entire emotional capacity had been consumed by anxiety and trauma responses. She joined the school soccer team, a leisure activity that had been unthinkable when she'd been barely managing basic functioning. She'd even begun keeping a journal, not as clinical documentation but as genuine self-reflection, processing her experiences and emerging from them with wisdom that seemed remarkable in a 9-year-old. The quarterly visits with Judge had become something Emma actually looked forward to. The judge had transformed, in Emma's mind, from an imposing authority figure into a mentor, someone who had recognized her distress and had taken action to protect her. Judge had given Emma a small gift at their first follow-up appointment, a small framed photograph of Bailey taken during one of the courtroom sessions, with Judge's handwritten inscription, "To Emma, whose courage to signal for help changed the system. Thank you for teaching us all what true strength looks like." Today's appointment felt celebratory. Judge had indicated in her notification that this would potentially be the final quarterly wellness check-in if Emma's progress continued at its current trajectory. The massive therapeutic intervention, the mandatory therapy, the gag order, the behavioral codes, the restructured custody arrangement, had functioned precisely as intended. Emma had healed. Her family had healed, and the legal system itself had been fundamentally transformed. As Emma waited in the courthouse hallway with Bailey at her side, she reflected on how different everything felt now. The same building that had been a symbol of her trauma had become a symbol of her salvation. The same legal system that had contributed to her pain had ultimately been the instrument of her healing. Judge's willingness to break from tradition, to acknowledge that something systemic was broken, and to take courageous action to fix it, that had made all the difference. Bailey sensed Emma's reflective mood and leaned more heavily against her leg, providing tactile grounding in the moment. The dog had been trained to provide specific therapeutic responses, but his affection for Emma transcended training. They had genuinely bonded, not as service animal and client, but as companions who had survived trauma together. When Judge emerged from her chambers, Emma stood immediately. The judge smiled warmly, a genuine expression of affection and pride in the girl's transformation. "Emma," Judge said, embracing her briefly, "I have been looking forward to this appointment. How are you feeling today?" "Good," Emma replied, her voice steady and confident, so different from the trembling whisper it had been 18 months earlier. "Really good. Doctor says I might not need therapy much longer, and my parents are actually getting along now. They're talking about maybe doing family vacation together next summer." Judge's expression filled with profound satisfaction. "That's extraordinary progress, Emma. You have worked so hard to heal, and your parents have honored their commitments to change. I'm genuinely proud of all of you." She gestured toward her office. "Let's talk about what comes next. I think it's time to transition you out of court-ordered therapy and into maintenance support, something ongoing but less intensive. You've demonstrated remarkable resilience, and I believe you're ready for the next phase of your healing." As they walked together into the judge's chambers, Bailey following faithfully at Emma's side, one truth seemed undeniable. A 9-year-old girl's signal to her dog, made in desperation within a hostile courtroom, had catalyzed change that extended far beyond her own family. It had transformed how an entire judicial system approached custody litigation. It had inspired the creation of new therapeutic interventions. It had taught lawyers, judges, and parents the importance of centering children's actual needs rather than adult interests. Emma Richardson's silent scream, expressed through a trained hand signal to a therapeutic companion, had become the loudest voice for systemic change. And as she left the courthouse that afternoon, walking freely with Bailey at her side and genuine peace in her heart, the victory was complete.